We're going to continue our series in Acts. And this morning I just want to focus on, really, it's a word, and just the question that comes is, I guess the question is, when you hear the word failure, what comes to your mind? When you heard the word failure, what comes to your heart? Because I think everyone has experienced this. There is always a moment when we make a mistake, or a moment when we fail, or a moment when we mess up, and it feels like we've ruined everything. Has anybody ever been there? I don't know if anybody's been there. I've done it so many times in my life where I mess up, I do something where I know I shouldn't, and I fail, and it feels like I've just destroyed God's plan for my life. Where everything is going well, everything is going great, and then boom, it falls out. The rug gets pulled out from under me. I had a friend that was called into ministry, and he was called into ministry about the same time I was, and we're going through high school together, and we were both going to be pastors, and God had these great plans for our lives, and we were so excited. But then about our junior, senior year, he decided that instead of going into ministry, he decided that he wanted to live his life first, is what he said, and started partying. And years later, when we were on the phone together, failure is what he felt like. I had a teen once show up to my house door. It was late at night. I was up in Michigan. It was late at night. We were all ready for bed, and all of a sudden I hear knocking on the door. So I run and open up the door, and the teen has this panicked look on his face. And he is just mortified. He's like, "Pastor Drew, I messed up big time." He's like, and he just went on, he's like, "Her dad is going to kill me. Because we lied and we snuck out, and he followed us. I'm dead. I have failed. My life is ruined." If you've had one of those moments where all of a sudden we find ourselves in a mess, and you know what? It's not a mess that someone created. It's our mess. Sometimes it's not even a big failure. Sometimes it's the smallest things that we find ourselves in. A small lie that we look back and we begin to regret. Or we lose our temper. We just blow up out of nowhere. We lose our temper. And then we realize, why did I do that? Or we say something that hurts someone else. And we fail. And we live with these regrets. And we fail ourselves. We fail others. And we fail God. Now this morning, what I want to do is I just want to take some time. I want to take some time and just talk about failure. In fact, I want to look at a failure that we find in Acts and just what we can learn from that moment. So if you would, Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 is where we're going to be. Acts chapter 7, we're going to pick up in verse 20. But I want to give you kind of where we are at this moment. We've looked at how the church kind of began and everything was going well. And they were fellowshipping together, and everyone was lifting each other up, and every need was met. And then we looked at how there was some pressure from the outside, and then there's also pressure from the inside, and how they dealt with conflict. We looked at conflict last week. And this picks up that they dealt with conflict, and they chose 7 men to kind of take care of the problem. Well, one of the men's name that they chose was Stephen. And Stephen it says about him, he was doing these great things. He was doing miracles. He was going around, and he was sharing Jesus with others. He was sharing Jesus. He was sharing the salvation message. He was telling people that, look, the only way we can have a relationship with God, it's not about religion, it's not about doing these things. The only way we can have a relationship with God is by following the Messiah, Jesus Christ. He said the Messiah that was promised, and he was speaking and talking to Jewish people who had been looking forward for the Messiah for thousands of years. And he said, this Messiah has come, and he gave up his life for us. He died on the cross, and he came back to life. He did not stay dead. He conquered death so that we can have eternal life when we put our faith in him. And that is the only way to have salvation. And he's sharing this message, and people are coming to Christ. People are following Christ. But opposition comes. from members of the synagogue. And they started getting mad about what he was teaching because they weren't following them anymore. And so they arrest him. They falsely accuse him. In fact, it even says they hire people to accuse him of things. They accuse him of being against Moses, which was kind of one of the forefathers of the faith, and being against the synagogue. So they stand him before trial, and they say, "Tell me, is this true?" And he goes into this great story. He starts from the beginning of the Israelites' history from Abram. And he goes through the history of the Israelites' nation. And he shows that how many times they rejected the chosen one of God. How many, when they rejected Abraham, when they rejected Moses, and they rejected the prophets. And he's going through, and in the middle of this speech, in the middle of this talk, when he's sharing about the faith, we get to Moses. And we get to Moses, and I know this isn't the point that he's making. This isn't his main point, but I want to take some moment, and I just kind of want to sidestep right here. I want to stop on Moses. I'm going to do a sidestep and kind of just hover on Moses and learn this valuable lesson that we can take from him. So even though we are in Acts, we're going to be talking about someone that lived thousands of years prior to that. And the lesson, because Moses makes a big-time mistake. Moses fails big time. And I know that it probably felt like he ruined everything. So that is where we pick up. This is in the middle of him telling the history. In verse 20, it says, "At that time Moses was born. And he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son." Now, at this point, what's happening in the Israelites' history, they are slaves in Egypt. And the Pharaoh just ordered all the baby boys to be killed. He said, when there's a baby boy to be born of the Israelites, the slaves, just take the baby and throw it in the river. Get rid of him. And so Moses' parents hide Moses. They keep him safe for as long as they can. And then they make a basket. They put him in the Nile. And if you've ever seen the movie or the cartoon, they put him in the river. And Pharaoh's daughter finds him, adopts him, and Moses is raised in the home of Pharaoh. When he was placed out, so Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was powerful in speech and action. I love this. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house, and it says he was raised with all the wisdom of the Egyptians. The Egyptians at this time were the most intelligent, the best instructed people in the entire world at this moment. Moses was taught arithmetic, geometry, poetry, music, medicine, hieroglyphics. There's an ancient saying that said out of the 10 portions of wisdom, the Egyptians got 9 of them, and the rest of the world got 1. That's how powerful, that's how amazing they were looked at. And it said not only was he trained in all of that, but Moses was powerful in speech, which means he could speak well. He was a great orator, or however you want to say it, right? Which kind of is interesting later on when he comes to God and says, "But I can't speak." He was great at speech, and he was powerful in action. Moses, according to history, was a military leader. By the age of 31, he was one of the best Egyptian leaders. He led the Egyptian army against the Ethiopians who invaded Egypt, and he wiped out their army and sent them running. He was strong, he was powerful, he was smart, he was everything anybody's looking for in a guy, right? If you were an Egyptian girl, you were like, wow, that's the guy. He was raised to be a leader. So when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. Moses knew his inheritance. He wasn't blind to who he was or where he came from. He knew who he was. And I'm going to jump real quick. You don't have to jump right there. I just want to read this. And Moses thought his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them. Moses knew who he was, and Moses knew his calling. I don't know, at some point, Moses was called to rescue the Israelites, and he knew it. I don't know if he had had these conversations with God his whole life or whatever, but at some point, God had said, I have a plan for you, and it is to lead my people. And God had put a calling on his life. In fact, we find this actually theme running through all Scripture, that God calls people to do great things for him. You know, sometimes it's huge things in our eyes, sometimes it's small things, but God has a calling for Moses, and God has a calling for you. God has a plan for your life. I remember when I was 13 years old, I was baptized at my church, and my pastor was, when I got into baptistry, he asked, do you want to say anything? And I wasn't planning on saying anything. I just wanted to get dunked and go. He said, do you want to say anything? I was going to say no, but I said, well, and I just started speaking. I gave a mini sermon that day. 13 years old, gave a mini sermon to the whole congregation. When I got done, there's an amazing couple came up to me and said, while you were talking, God told me that you are going to be a pastor. And God placed a calling on my life. My little brother, Anthony, I remember at camp one year, I was actually his youth pastor. It's a blast. If you ever get to be your own brother's youth pastor, it's wonderful. Because they listen to you. I remember at youth camp one day, my brother came down to an altar and was praying. And he stood up and he said, Andrew, God just told me what I was going to be. And I was like, he's going to be a pastor. I know God's calling him to be a pastor. He's like, God told me that I'm going to work on computers. And I was like, really? I guess so. And guess what? God led him to work on computers. I had a roommate in college that was called to change people with art. God calls us to many different things. Some of us are called to just stay at home and raise our children, teach them about God. My mom and dad were called into volunteer children's ministry. You have been called to do something great for God. He has a special plan for you. Just like Moses. Moses knew his calling. He was like, I am called to lead the Israelites. Look, I have been raised up to be the leader. He knew his inheritance. So when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites, and he saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses was going around, he sees the oppression, he's been trained, he's been groomed for 40 years to do this, and now was the time he looks out and he sees this horrible injustice. And he decides to take matters into his own hands. He says, you know what? Enough waiting. It's time. Right now's the time. And so he kills the Egyptian. We find out in Exodus, he hides the body. He gets ready to lead. Certainly the Israelites will see how amazing he is. Certainly they will see that he's been trained by Pharaoh. He will be their savior. Certainly they're going to realize that God has chosen him. So he takes the matters in his own hand. He kills this man. He hides the body. He is ready to lead. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them. He's like, of course they're going to see it. Look how great I am. But they did not. They did not see it. The next day, in fact, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you're brothers. Why do you hurt each other? But the man who was mistreating the other one pushes Moses aside and says, well, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me just like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Imagine how disappointed Moses would have been. Imagine the dream crushed at that moment. He knows God's chosen him. He has been trained his entire life. He's ready to lead. He's ready to gather them. And they say, well, who made you ruler over us? It reminds me of a child when it's not your child and they look at, well, you're not my mom. You're not my dad. I don't have to listen to you. They look at him and say, well, we don't have to listen to you. He knew they would, but they did not. He could see God working in his life. He had been given the training, the education. He knew he was called. He had a dream. He had the passion. He had the drive. But all that was crushed. His life was dismantled. He failed. See, here's the thing. He thought that if he killed the Egyptian was going to help. He thought by doing that it was going to help, but he quickly realized how big of a mistake that was. I'm sure at some moment, either as he's heading off, as he's running away, fearing for his life, I'm sure at one moment he was thinking, how could I have been so far off base? What happened? How could I have been so blind? How could I have failed so miserably? And in verse 30, we find out that he has been 40 years in the desert. 40 years in the desert just waiting, giving up on his dreams, being crushed by failure. Moses was called to lead the Israelites. And eventually God did use him. But not before this moment. So how did this happen? How did this happen? I think verse 24 kind of starts giving us this glimpse. Verse 24, he saw one of the Egyptians being mistreated, and so he took God's timing into his own hands. Here's the thing. We have a tendency, and I don't know if you realize this or not, or if maybe it's just my tendency, but we have a tendency that when we understand God's will for our life and what it is, but things aren't happening fast enough to suit us, we become anxious and we try to give God a hand. When things aren't going the way we want to do it, we kind of say, you know what, God, let me help you and do it myself. Let me take this into my own hand. You know what, I can do this. You can just play the background. When you look at Moses, did the taskmaster deserve to be punished? Absolutely yes. Was it wrong for him to beat the Hebrew as he did? Yes, of course. But when Moses stepped in and began his own deliverance, his own operation, when he was energized to do it, he was not energized by the Spirit of God, he was energized by his own flesh. Not one point do we find Moses stopping and consulting God on what to do. He didn't seek God's timing, he didn't seek God's justice. He just did. He saw what was happening, and I'm sure he was like, you know what, I don't need to consult God on this. I'm Moses. I'm the Moses. I know my calling, and it's about time we get this going. And so he took action. But he didn't take action out of God's Spirit. He took action out of pride, out of hate, out of anger. So when we act in the flesh, we will always have something to cover up. When we do it on our own, it's just a matter of time until the truth catches up with us and we face our failure. Chuck Swindoll has this quote. I love it. It says this in the commentary when I was reading about Moses. It says, neglecting to ask God's counsel, neglecting to seek God's timing, you step in to handle things. And by, you've got a mess on your hands. You're stuck with a corpse, with a shovel in your hands, and a shallow grave at your feet. When we don't stop to seek God's counsel, we don't seek God's will, and we take it in our own hands, we fail. We make a mess. I love this. Moses' motivation was right, but his timing and his methods were all wrong. See, the thing is, Moses' plans were not the same as God's. We fail when we do it on our own power. We fail when we take matters into our own hands. We fail when we don't consult God and His will. We can't do it on our own. But we have victory. We have victory when we stop and consult God. We have victory when we do His will. Moses failed, and now 40 years passes. I find this amazing that it took 40 years after his failure before God brings him back. And I'm sure Moses wanted it now at this moment, but God's timing was different. God's timing was he had Moses wait for 40 more years. God delayed the deliverance of his people for 40 years. You know, when I read this, when I think about it, in my eyes, I think, wow, what a waste of time. But in God's eyes, it's no, it's not a waste, it's perfect timing. I always wonder what changed from that day to 40 years later. I wonder if it was Moses. I know Moses changed in those 40 years. Maybe it was the people. I don't know exactly what all had to take place, but God did. God knew that it would take 40 years before Moses could fulfill his calling. And Moses had to wait. Moses had to wait. You know, sometimes we don't like to wait. In fact, this is a common thing that we've talked about before, that we just cannot stand waiting on God's timing. I remember growing up, and probably you, I had the same phone number and the same phone for probably about my entire life. Does anybody remember their phone number growing up? 419-589-9580, right? I'm not going to say it like that. For 20 years, I had the same phone number. Same phone. We had the phone that had the cord that was pretty long, and eventually we stretched it out that it reached 2 rooms until we broke it, and Dad didn't replace the phone, he just replaced the cord to make it even longer. It was okay. Now we don't like to wait so much that if you have the same cell phone for 2 years, that's way outdated. I don't know if you remember this commercial. I don't remember who did it. This was a couple years ago. Their commercial came out and they were like, 2 years is too long to wait for the new phone. Imagine having to wait 2 years to get a new phone. If you join us, you can get a new phone every year. We can't wait on anything now. Driving, traffic, eating, everything is now. It's our culture. We want it now. And then God steps into our culture. God steps into our life, and we want it now. And he says, wait. But God, you called me to do this. God, you called me to lead the Israelites. And he says, not yet. But God, I'm ready to do your will right now. I'm ready. It's eating me up inside. Let's go. And God says, wait. We don't want to wait on God's timing for our lives. We don't want to wait on him. We cannot. It seems like we just can't wait. It just kills us inside. We want to do it now. We want to experience it now. We want to see the results right now. We don't want to wait a month or 9 months or years or even decades. We fail. We fail when we don't wait on God's timing. We fail when we don't wait on his timing for us. But we have victory when we trust his delay. When we trust his delay, he will work on us. He will work on them. He will prepare the doors to open. He has it. We just have to trust his delay. We fail when we try to do it on our own, but we have victory when we rely on his power. We fail when we try to do it on our timing and we don't trust his delay, but we have victory when we rely on his timing. And finally, I think this is my favorite part. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. If you know the rest of the story, this is what happened. God tells Moses, hey, I'm ready for you. Moses says, well, I'm not ready now. They have a little bit of a discussion. God uses Moses to lead the Israelites, and Moses becomes one of the most famous people in Scripture. This is my favorite part because, listen, God is capable of working for us and in us in spite of us. I said again, God is capable of working for us and in us in spite of us. He can use us in spite of our failure. No matter how big of a failure, no matter how big of a mistake, He will use us. Imagine being Moses, and I'm sure he thought that his mistake messed everything up. I'm sure when Moses went to the desert, he had given up on his calling, and he said, God will never use me again. I am a failure. I'm done. I mean, just look at how he responded when God called him. God came up to him and called him, and he was like, God, I'm not your man. I'm broken. God, you can't use me. God, I can't speak anymore. I'm scared. They're not going to listen to me. God, I'm broken. I failed. And God, inside that burning bush, said, that is exactly why I want you. See, God takes this broken down failure and leads him to free the Israelites. God takes Moses, the man who messed everything up so bad on his own, and uses him to change the world. You know, Moses' name is mentioned over 700 times in the Bible. He was used by God in a greater way than any other Old Testament character. When he, through failure, learned to follow God's plan rather than his own. If Moses can raise up from his failures and be used by God, so can we. If God can heal a broken man like Moses, then he can heal us. So this morning as we close, let's just take this lesson from Moses and realize that let's not do it on our own. Let's have victory in his power. Let's do it with his power. Let's wait on God's timing. Let him pause our life. Wait on his timing and trust in him. And remember that God can teach us and he can use us in spite of our failure.